What's better than locking a bunch of power-hungry elderly cardinals in a room for hours on end? Well, try doing it for 3 years. 3 years of manic political tug-of-war over who'd get to wear the pointy hat and run the Catholic Church. This is the Conclave of 1268, the longest papal election in history. You don't get to a 3-year standoff without some pretty serious baggage, so let's rewind a bit. So here's the deal. The Pope, before all of this tomfoolery, was a guy called Clement IV. This guy seemed to have a little issue. Well, a big issue with the Hohenstaufens. Now I know what you're thinking, pretty funny name. But it turns out these guys were actually a pretty powerful German noble family that somehow clawed their way into ruling the Holy Roman Empire. As you do. Clement IV, he didn't like that one bit. So the Pope does the absolute worst thing ever. The worst thing you could possibly ever do when you're in a bit of a power struggle like this. He asks the French for help. Now Clement calls up a guy named Charles of Anjou, a French prince, and more or less says, hey, go kill these guys for me and I'll give you a kingdom, cross my heart. Pretty sweet deal. Charles says fair enough and basically bum rushes the Holy Roman Empire's southern stronghold. It's quick, brutal, and somehow he actually pulls it off. Execution here, beheading there, yada yada yada. Charles ends up king of Sicily, which by the way is technically papal land, but shh. Now he's basically just chilling in Italy, dirtying up the place with his Frenchness and a massive army, including a whole lot of influence over the Catholic Church. Then, at the absolute perfect time, Clement kicks the bucket, leaving the Catholic Church leaderless, Italy crawling with French troops, and a spiritual crisis held together with spite, incense, and delusion. So it's basically tradition at this point. The Pope dies, chaos erupts, the conclave drags on, and eventually someone walks out with a new name and a funny hat. Although that wasn't quite the case this time. The cardinals weren't exactly lounging at Vatican City because it didn't quite exist yet. Instead, these guys were held up in Viterbo. Viterbo was a quiet hill town that more or less became papal HQ because at this point, Rome was basically the purge, just with more spaghetti. The cardinals were just going back and forth over who should be the next pope. Half of them were on Team France, ready to elect whoever Charles of Anjou told them to. The other half didn't want to listen to no goddamn Frenchmen and wanted to elect their own guy completely outside the influence of Charles of Anjou. It's hilarious. The main concern of the Catholic Church at that point wasn't about whether or not they could elect a pope based on divine godly influence. It was whether or not they could choose a guy that was not French. Frankly, I think it's totally fair to be cautious. It's not like electing a French pope would exile the papacy to France for 7 decades. You didn't have to cut me off. I could never know we were nothing. I don't even need your love, but you treat me like a stranger and I feel so loved. It's important to note that the conclave process wasn't exactly set in stone at this point. It was more or less no holds barred, complete just cage fighting with these old guys. Throwing hands with words, it took as long as it had to take. There was no time limit. And believe me, they were not in a rush. I mean, why they would put the head of the Catholic Church in a country that revolves so heavily around arguing and hand gestures, it astounds me, dude. It's so funny. Regardless, under conclave, these fellas were allowed to roam around freely wherever they wanted. That's super important because these guys would just talk in private with other cardinals during the conclave process, and this would give them the opportunity to negotiate, but more likely than not, it just made it easier to bribe each other. They were living it up. Full meals, no deadline, and a divine excuse to avoid responsibility. Not to mention the whole voting process was non-existent. Half the time the Pope was just chosen through like political influence. It's happened more often than not in the past. Other than that, it's the most sacred of all manners of choosing, bribery. So here they are arguing day in and day out over who should succeed Clement. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, and before anyone notices, years are slipping by. Meanwhile, the locals of Viterbo starting to get a bit frustrated. I mean, you gotta look at it from their perspective. These cardinals just rock up one day, 200, 300 of them, and completely overrun their town for years on end. Eating up all the pasta, drinking up all the wine. So the funny thing is, the mayor basically locks them inside the building where they're holding the conclave. And this kicks off like a whole siege of attrition thing. He cuts their food rations and starves them out and waits for divine intervention or mental breakdown, whichever one comes first. These guys must have been in a pretty heated argument because this didn't work one bit. In fact, the cardinals didn't even bat an eye, they just kept arguing. It actually makes you wonder what they were doing in there. Like, I'm sure most arguments could be summed up and resolved within like a few weeks at most, especially considering they're isolated in the one room for most of the day, just arguing back and forth. 3 years, like, that's insane. That's biblical levels of stubbornness. Then in one of the pettiest and most glorious moments in Catholic history, they rip the roof off the building, leaving the cardinals exposed to wind, rain, and bird shit until they figure it out. By God, they figured it out. After nearly 1,000 days, they finally throw in the towel and pick their new leader. Teobaldo Visconti, a guy who wasn't even there. He wasn't even in the country. He was thousands of miles away, crusading in the Holy Land, having a blast with the fellas. Out of nowhere, he's told to drop the sword and grab the keys to the Vatican because, surprise, you're the new Pope now. Visconti was neutral, uncontroversial, and like most guys in his position, didn't even want the job anyway. I mean, we're not sure like what the Vatican saw in this completely unaffiliated guy that day, but there's one thing that's certain. He was not French. Geez, that's one thing that actually like survived through the ages. The utter and absolute hatred for French. It's like a cockroach. It survives no matter what. It is the human condition to hate the French. Anyways, Visconti rocks up, gets the job, signs the contracts, gets the uniform, and decides to call himself Gregory the 10th. You might be thinking, is yanking some random guy off the road and handing him the keys to one of the most powerful institutions on earth a bad idea? Apparently not. Like, he was actually a really decent guy and a pretty solid pope too. He reformed the conclave system, pushed for peace in Europe, and even tried to patch things up with the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it didn't work, but I mean, you gotta give the guy credit. You might be wondering whatever happened to everyone's favorite snail eater, Charles of Anjou, temporary king of Sicily. Well, after a failed attempt of trying to manipulate the conclave system for 3 whole years, people decided that they actually hated being under French occupation. Like, a lot.
Mandiamo I carabinieri, ma li mandiamo con I lanciafiamme.
So in particular southern Italian fashion, the locals decided that they'd stage an uprising against the Frenchmen. And what ensued was a slaughter of thousands of French soldiers, resulting in Anjou losing Sicily in spectacular fashion. Long story short, he spent the rest of his very limited days plotting and scheming for a return to glory moment, but he died a few years later in 1285. Back to old Greg though. So yeah, Pope Gregory reformed the conclave system because he wasn't going to let that madness happen again. I mean, imagine if the conclave went on for 3 years today. Half of the cardinals would die mid-vote of old age. I guess that way it kind of gives you like a Royal Rumble mortality style conclave, which, I mean, it's pretty cool. So at the Second Council of Lyon, Gregory more or less said, I'm going to lock you in a room. You're not allowed to leave until you choose a new pope. Hurry the fuck up. This is why we have the conclave format that we're using now. Side note, at the time of writing this video, there was a conclave currently happening. Yes, I was trying to game the algorithm by doing a conclave video during a conclave, but my computer blew up, so I haven't been able to finish it. Alright, bye.